Hello and welcome back to the Exam Study Experts podcast and to our summer schedule, which, as in previous years, is a nice excuse for us to bring back and resurface some gems from the archives that you may have overlooked or maybe well worth a re-listen, as well as bringing you some fresh conversations, which I think you, dear listener, will find very stimulating and inspiring, but can otherwise be maybe just a little tricky to weave into our regular broadcast schedule. This week's episode is a fresh conversation for you, a little bit tangential to the core topic of studying smarter and passing your exams, zooming out, as we sometimes do in the summer, to look at your journey a little bit more broadly. Just to explain, I think this is a great episode. I think you're really going to enjoy this. We are rejoined today, I'm excited to say, by a former student story star. You may remember Charlie from episode 75 if you've been with us for a while. We met Charlie some years ago when he was sharing details of getting through his law school exams. That was his student story episode in 75. So if you're studying for law exams or other exams that have a lot of difficult information to learn, there's a really nice case study of how he applied some of the key ideas from this podcast. He'd been a podcast listener for a little while. Since then, Charlie has gone through something of a rebirth after struggling to enjoy the career in law that he'd striven for so long. And he ultimately ended up doing a huge piece of research, drawing on some of his skills as a historian perhaps, to try and understand people's career journeys and what can lead to enjoyment and satisfaction. And this all culminated in a major book called Is This Working? I know Charlie in real life. He's a friend in the real world, and he landed a really significant publishing deal for the book, and he did really well for this. So really proud of him, and kind of excited to showcase some of his findings today. I think just to give a little bit of my own perspective on, I think, why this conversation is, and why I'm so excited to bring this conversation to you. I know that the folk tuning into this show do so in order to achieve academic goals. But I also know that those goals are generally a means to an end rather than the end in itself. You might be kind of towards the end of your career, and maybe you're taking a course just as almost like literally a hobby. You know, you're at the opposite end of your career. You've done with the world of work, and sort of in retirement, you're taking a course literally for the pure love of learning and because you enjoy it and because you want the learnings. But I think for the majority of people listening, we are studying with a goal in mind. So we're studying for exams at school to get into our preferred university or college. We're studying for exams at university to access our preferred career path, like Charlie was with his law exams. Or maybe in order to earn a place on a programme of further study or research and stay in the world of academia. Or for many listeners, you might be studying for professional certifications in order to advance your career and get promotion, move to the next step in your career path. So, but wherever you are on your journey, there's this sense of kind of the exams forming part of your path, part of your journey. And I think it's really important, and something we perhaps don't talk about enough, either on this show specifically or society as a whole, we don't talk enough about sort of stepping back and taking the time to think about where we are on the journey, what our next steps are, and whether we're kind of making the next right step for us. Charlie hit a little bit of a rock bottom moment when he realised, after years and years of working towards a career in law, he really didn't enjoy the work. And that's kind of what triggered him to go and do this huge piece of work, interviewing kind of about 100 people about their careers, what led them to them, what they enjoy about their work and so forth. And he was aiming in those sort of 100 or so people to get a representative cross-section of all different kinds of jobs in society, from the manual to the creative, to the technical, to the executive, everything represented. And there were some really fascinating lessons in this, and the stories he tells and kind of the things he found out from talking to all these people. I think there's some really fascinating lessons for all of us as we aspire to build rewarding and fulfilling careers and lives for ourselves. And I've taken a little bit of time because there's quite a lot in this episode. So I've taken a little bit of time and I've summarised my top takeaways at the end of this interview. I think we're well worth tuning in for that because I've sort of taken a bit of time to go through and pick out some of the highlights and the key messages. But I think it's worth listening to the interview first so you kind of understand the context and the stories behind the ideas so that they land. So without further ado, let me welcome Charlie Colenutt back to the Exam Study Expert podcast. I kicked off our conversation by asking him to give us just a little of the backstory of his journey to date by way of context to bring us up to speed.
Thank you very much, Will. The story of my working life, I suppose we'll start at university. where I did a history degree. As with lots of people that do degrees that they're kind of passionate about and follow their interests, I didn't really know where it would lead professionally. That kind of state of uncertainty and insecurity is when you're often kind of vulnerable to the ideas of others and not so much things that are kind of internal to you. So I ended up becoming a lawyer. It's not wholly because I knew lots of other people that were becoming lawyers, and that seemed to be a very sensible and pragmatic thing to do with a history degree. If you wanted to live in the southeast and buy a house and have a family, then you ought to do a sensible thing and become a lawyer. And so, yeah, I was probably led by external motivations and not so much by what would actually probably make me happy deep down. I had considered going to the US to do a PhD in history, but for various personal reasons, I decided to stay in the UK. And that left a kind of, well, what else am I going to do type vacuum. And then the thing with professional services jobs like law and accountancy is that it's very much an extension of university, in that when you go to university, there's this structure laid out for you. You know what you're going to be doing in year 1, year 2, year 3. That structure is marked by assessments, as you well know. And there's a kind of comfort blanket nature to that. With law, it's exactly the same. I did a law conversion course and then a bar course. And then the next stage, year 3, would be a pupillage, a training year at a set of chambers. And then after that, you would be out there practicing as a lawyer, still with clear markers of success. You know, how much are you earning? How many years qualified are you? What type of work are you taking on? So you're on a kind of lazy river being swept along by this very structured career. And I think I probably would have carried on that lazy river. It wasn't that lazy, I suppose, because it was quite hard work. The exams are very tough. And the work itself is, quite long hours and intellectually demanding. For me, I was doing a commercial pupillage, which is the training year that barristers do. And that involved reading huge amounts of material, sort of construction contracts with appendices that would go on to 700, 800 pages, and then writing very long documents about those very long documents that you've just read. But yeah, I started in September 2020, which is obviously during COVID. I think COVID acted as a bit of a kind of electric shock to the system, where I was sort of traveling down a particular path. That winter lockdown, I don't know if you remember it, but in January 2021, I was basically in a flat by myself, staring at a screen for very long hours and then just going to bed. And it was dark outside the entire time. And it really stripped away all of the kind of aspects of being a barrister that I probably would have found some comfort in. So there's the kind of camaraderie, there's the status, being able to wear a suit and parade around. It left you with the core elements of the job, which for me, I just did not find very fulfilling at all. I became quite unhappy and quickly realized through talking to people that, there was one clear source of the unhappiness, and that was the fact that I didn't enjoy the work at all, really. And this was the work at its most basic and most stripped back. So if I couldn't enjoy this, then surely I probably wasn't going to enjoy the next 40 years. And so I decided to leave. I said, well, I'll finish my pupillage, so I've got some kind of qualification, and then maybe I'll go back to law, but I don't think I will. At about that time, or maybe just before I'd started pupillage, I'd read this book by an American oral historian and radio broadcaster called Studs Terkel. Is a great name. And it's called Working. And he basically traveled around Chicago, putting down a tape recorder in front of ordinary working people. Well, not some ordinary, some extraordinary. So there's baseball stars, waitresses, coal miners, people that work in car factory plants. And this is in the early 1970s. And he got them to talk about their jobs, sort of describe in detail what they do all day, tell them how they feel about what they do all day. And it's this wonderful kind of choral work of people doing wildly different things with their days, whether it's strip mining coal or being an accountant, and yet saying similar things about what they experience at work and the kind of humiliations and satisfactions of it all. So I'd read this book and I'd loved it, and I thought, wow, it'd be really cool to do this, 50 years on in the UK. And leaving my job as a lawyer was kind of the trigger for thinking, well, I don't know what else what else is out there. Doing this book would be kind of interesting by itself, but also it might tell me what I wanted to do with my life. If I spoke to enough people, then maybe I'd have a clear answer about, the perfect job for me. And I don't think it gave me that, but it was certainly so I started traveling around the UK, just talking to people about their jobs, whether that's carers, mechanics, doctors, lawyers, investment bankers, the whole kind of sweep of society. And the idea was it was a kind of cross section. If you imagine the UK working population as a village, then this was me walking around the village and just talking to people. That's probably, a not very abridged account of my working life so far.
Well, it's a good point to pick up the story. So, so you were in this situation where you were you'd achieved your goal of getting into law and passing your exams, and you were on the path, and kind of just finding the fundamentals of the job quite dissatisfying. And you mentioned you're quite unhappy in it. I'm sure it's an experience many people have when they finally get into their inverted commas dream career and find actually maybe this isn't quite what I was hoping for, and I think possibly there's an exacerbating factor when it's something you've worked so hard for so long and had your sights on for so long, and then it's a bit disappointing. Like, I think it doubles the disappointment compared to if you just sort of fallen into it. You've almost built it up so much and put so much into it. The disappointment, the sting is kind of even worse when you're not enjoying it. So one of your motivations for doing the book and doing the exercise was a personal one. I think you wanted to kind of find out a bit about sort of perspectives, wisdom on the world of work, and maybe use that to kind of inform your next steps and where you want to go in your life. So what did you learn? What become some of your big personal takeaways that are sort of shaping your next steps and where you're going with your working life next?
Well, it was interesting to see the lack of plan and the sheer randomness that defined so many people's careers. So there was, software developers that only got into working with computers because, there was one site reliability engineer who his boss broke his leg, and he was then allowed to start managing the network. And then that led him from a career in, I think he was working in IT in a school, and that led him to London and a kind of really promising career in tech. There was somebody else that was working as a receptionist and was playing the computer game Doom in her spare time and loved it, and was only introduced to that by an ex-boyfriend. And then she realized that she also loved working with computers as a result of playing so much of that, and was begging the IT department at her company to let her have a go at resolving some support tickets. And it was only when one of them fell ill and she was allowed to take over for a few weeks that her career in software started. And throughout it, there's just all these sort of extraordinarily random career stories where no one at any point in all the 100 interviews I did sat down and thought, what are my skills? What job best accords with these skills? What career goals should I have?
So I mean, that kind of randomness is really interesting. I mean, so many people sit down and have that plan and they kind of come up with that. As you describing, any careers advisor worth their salt will say, "Oh, what are your skills? What are your strengths?" And okay, well, what sort of careers are going to be most suited to you? I mean, I guess I'm kind of interested in the kind of who if careers and working life is a game. I think the most important measure, certainly as I see it, is kind of your fulfillment, your satisfaction, and how much you enjoy it. Like a certain level of money for sure is important. Like, it's vital to have a certain level of needs met. Highly desirable to have some finance left over beyond your basic needs to cover some wants. But I think, there's increasingly an awareness, I think perhaps from what I see, kind of particularly from the generation just entering the workforce now, that money is not the end goal, or certainly not the only end goal. Like, it's necessary but not sufficient. So from all these different stories, I was just curious, like, who struck you as the most happy, the most fulfilled in their work? Like, is it the high paid bankers and lawyers? Is it the careers stereotypically associated with job satisfaction, like people in kind of some form of education or caring for people, healthcare? Like, is it those pursuing a kind of a creative calling? Or is it just like totally random? Like, were there any patterns in terms of who had cracked being able to find some satisfaction, some enjoyment in their work?
So as you say, there was no real pattern as to income and salary and happiness and satisfaction. I mean, people that were working in sort of truly precarious jobs, like interviewed a gig delivery rider, and he also worked part-time as a carer. Just the fact that the money was so inconsistent and low caused him a huge amount of stress in life. But beyond, as you say, a certain level, there was no correspondence really in the interviews that I did between salary and satisfaction at work. I think, in fact, the people that seemed most satisfied were those that had gone through some kind of experience where they had hit some kind of rock bottom with their career. So I interviewed a joiner, so like a carpenter, who had been working in a factory, was in a huge amount of debt. I think something like nearly £10,000 of debt, and had just had a child, and was completely despondent about the direction that his life was going in. He then took a risk and decided to borrow some of his friends' tools and sort of strike out as a joiner, self-employed. Was doing, living hand to mouth, where for each job he would use that to buy the tools that he needed for the next job. And if he didn't have the tools, then he would put off the job until he could do enough work to buy those tools. And then within a couple of years, he had cleared the debt and was working for himself. And there were lots of frustrations in his work, in the all the frustrations that you have working in the construction industry, in that it's hard work, long hours sometimes, and people aren't paying you, all of that kind of stuff. But having been through that experience of kind of looking around at his life and thinking, I need to make some kind of drastic change here, there was a kind of level of gratitude and appreciation for where he was. And he didn't have any ambitions to go much further beyond where he was. And he was saying, I don't want a fleet of 10 vans and £1 million a year. I'm happy where I am because everything is balanced. And likewise, there were, I interviewed someone that had come to the UK without any right to work from South America, and, had been working in one of those kind of dodgy operators who drives a minibus full of cleaners and pays them £4 an hour, drops them off at various fancy houses, and then takes whatever the difference is from what they're actually being paid, probably sort of £15 an hour, for himself. And then she had then since set out and started to find her own work, and was then managing her own cleaning company. And again, there's that kind of great deep sense of gratitude. And so I suppose it's that old thing of like, well, if you wouldn't be happy in a mud hut, then you're not going to be happy anywhere, because actually it's not so much about the environment you're in, but it's about your perspective on it. And yeah, by the same token, there are people working very, very fancy jobs, earning significant amounts of money. I think of the trader in an investment bank who was saying that she just felt like a number, had been was talking about children and watching a toddler push a car across a room and seeing the smile that the child gets from seeing cause and effect so obviously. And she felt that she didn't get any of that in the job that she was doing. So yeah, there's patterns are maybe not the kind of in the conventional sense of the job the actual task you're doing and the money you're earning, but in a more kind of emotional sense, I suppose.
I think the point about the difference between your kind of rock bottom and then where you are now, that kind of contrast is sort of a really interesting point. And I obviously don't mean to make light at all of how terrifying it can be when you feel like you're kind of in crisis and can't provide for yourself, but for your family. And I the first, kind of there's an element to which that sort of rings true for me. The early years of exam study expert life, before I was sort of established, were financially quite stretching, as I was getting established. And the contrast between that and now, I don't have a fleet of 10 vans and millions of pounds of income a year, but I don't feel I need that. I need enough to kind of take care of myself and my family, and the sense of sort of satisfaction and the kind of appreciation you get for that, I think, is a lot higher as a result of having gone through that experience. So I really do kind of relate to that. I think that's a really interesting insight. I'm sort of curious, like, do you notice any changes in how different generations approach the idea of work? And you were chatting just before we spoke, and you mentioned some careers advisors have been reaching out to you, and perhaps a slight frustration from careers advisors in some quarters that everyone's trying to wanting to go for the big salaries and in the UK, trying to aim for kind of London life and things. I'm just sort of curious, are there any sort of trends you notice between generations and how they approach the idea of, work and developing a career?
Well, I interviewed quite a few people in their 20s and early 30s. So I suppose that's late millennials and early Gen Zs. For them, it's been quite a kind of interesting experience of the workplace in the time that they've been around in the workforce. You've had kind of Silicon Valley at peak pomp, and all of the ideas about what work should be and what an office should look like seem to sort of come out of California and traveled around the world. So the whole kind of discussions about bringing your whole self to work, the idea that your job should be a kind of core part of your identity. And if you're not, very few people in that generation are, going to church and engaging in civic life because they're, renting and moving house every year. And so work was kind of held out as this place where you would, I suppose the word is self-actualize. I don't really know what that means, but that's what everyone, the word everyone seems to use. It leads to a kind of raising of hopes about what work will do for you. When you go to the office, you expect to, if people are saying, bring your whole self to work, we're all a family, etc., then you expect to find that when you enter the workforce. And for many of the late 20-somethings and early 30-somethings that I interviewed, they kind of had believed that. And then they get into the workforce and into their career. And you realize that that's just one part of the company talking. Often, HR departments trying to advertise the company out to potential applicants and to clients. But in fact, the internal dynamics of the company run very differently. So, for instance, there was a management consultant who had, they were doing some training on sexual harassment, and the firm's policy had been very much, we are zero tolerance to any kind of sexual harassment and that kind of thing. And she'd had an experience with a client where the client had been saying things along the lines of, women shouldn't be engineers, they belong in the kitchen, all that kind of stuff. And she raised this at the workplace training. And one of the partners that was managing the training said, yes, I know we say zero tolerance, but it's very difficult when it's a client, isn't it? Because you don't want to jeopardize the contract. And so I think you did the right thing there, not saying anything or reporting it, because we've got to protect our relationships with our clients. And that's probably how these companies have run for decades. But it's a kind of interesting example of the hopes and expectations that have been raised about what work should be, and then the realities that people find once they begin their careers.
Yeah. And there's another one that you raise in the conclusion section of the book, which is about not too much admin. So many jobs now kind of have a whole lot of paperwork and kind of effectively associated with them. That's not the core task of the job. It's kind of work to do with the work. And I guess the lesson there is, well, we'll need some of that. If that takes over too much of the job, then that can get quite frustrating for the people doing the job. I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about that idea.
Yeah, I suppose it comes back to this idea of crisis. Several of the interviews, or several of the interviewees were considering, maybe in the last year or two, were considering leaving their jobs because they found it too overwhelming, too stressful. They're burnt out. And those were particularly people that were working in vocational professions, so teachers and people that were working in the NHS. And there's a kind of parallel with what we were talking about earlier with Gen Z and millennials, where there too you have great expectations of what your job will be because you feel called to it, you feel like you're doing good. And then when the reality, and you set so much of your identity by that job, and when the reality doesn't then live up to that or is too difficult, then it's a kind of extremely painful experience because of that gap between the expectations and the reality. And so the way that several of my interviewees managed to stay on in those careers was by a kind of conscious stepping back and kind of looking at things in the whole and saying, I'm extremely stressed and burnt out. There's a huge amount of my job that I find deeply frustrating. And that part of my job is often irrelevant to the kind of true purpose of my job. So, for instance, a teacher was spending a huge amount of time responding to parent emails and management emails and doing marking and data drops and all of this other stuff that is, when it comes down to it, is separate from the job of teaching and being in front of a classroom and getting kids to learn stuff. So she decided that she was going to take her work email off her phone, stop being a kind of goody two-shoes when it comes to senior leadership asking people to do things, stop, I think, responding to parent emails with the same frequency, and just kind of focus on being the best teacher in the classroom that she could be and doing marking as she went around in the classroom. And that stepping back, then she said, I feel completely different now in terms of my relationship with work. So she was, I suppose, in some senses caring less, but in other senses was kind of redirecting her care towards the kind of true essence of the job, which is teaching. And so I suppose that's a kind of broader theme that we've been talking about a bit today, which is that there is this kind of heart of one's job, and so much of work gets in the way of that heart. So we talked about admin and worrying about money and worrying about what other people might think of you or worrying about status. All of that is external to the heart of your job. And so all of these are different ways of kind of focusing on what really matters when it comes to work.
You say that when it comes to that, if we can manage to find ourselves a job where, we are not swamped by all the admin, you talk about how a good task is one with a clear and immediate result. Could you give us some examples of what that looks like?
Yeah, I suppose this was a kind of comparison with, I definitely felt this when I was doing law, that you're writing these extremely long advice documents and you send them out to the client or to whoever, and there's no real sense of like, was that a good thing that I did? Was it successful in its aim? And doing these interviews and listening to people, so there was a cleaner who was talking about the sense of satisfaction she got from cleaning a room, and she would say that she'd clean it and then she'd look back and think, "Ooh, lovely." Like that kind of "ooh, lovely" thing is such an important thing when it comes to the tasks that you're doing day to day. And yes, they're kind of associated with kind of manual work, in that there you're kind of making and shaping something in the real world. So perhaps it's easier to see that the outcome, have I done the task well? does this thing that I've created do the job that I intended it to do? But also you see it with software developers. I interviewed a software developer who was saying that he likes it because it feels like it's the kind of closest thing you can do on a computer to working with your hands. You can test the code, you can see if it works. You've got this clear idea in your mind of what you're trying to call forth. Yeah, it either works or it doesn't. It's a very difficult thing because so many of the jobs that we seem to be creating in our modern economy revolve around email and things like, I suppose, content marketing, HR. It's quite, when you're spending a lot of your time just responding to emails and communicating, it's hard to see what in the real world you have accomplished that day. And certainly the interviewees that could see that were in some senses more satisfied.
I think I know exactly what you mean when you're kind of removed from the end product and what you're producing as reports and PowerPoints and emails and stuff. It can be a little bit harder. From my own time in that kind of world, pre-exam study expert for me, I was deeply unhappy in jobs where for long stretches I might not get any or barely any kind of feedback on the quality of my work. I needed, internally from the people I was, from my kind of line managers, supervisors, effectively. I desperately need. I had a desperate need for that kind of validation. If I spent maybe weeks putting a report together or some analysis, I really needed that. Like, I had a real sort of psychological need to know it was good and know they thought it was good. And if that was the case, then that was okay. Like, it didn't need much. It just needed that, that was a good job. And if it wasn't good, that's okay. Like, help me learn from that and I'll get better next time. And there's quite a big variation. Some people I worked with did a great job of that. Some not very good at all. And it made such a difference to my kind of happiness at work and my satisfaction when that was in place, compared to when it wasn't. And so I suppose a lesson for anyone listening to this who does have some management responsibility or line management responsibility or aspires to in future, particularly in a situation where the end product is a little bit more intangible, giving that feedback to your reports can be huge for their overall happiness and enjoyment of work and life generally.
Yeah, that cleaner that I mentioned, she used to get texts from her clients afterwards, after she'd been, and they'd say, "Oh, the house looks amazing. Thank you so much. It's kind of perfect start to the weekend," basically. And she was saying how much she loved getting those texts and how buzzing she was every time she got them. So yeah, all these things cost so little, don't they? But mean so much to everyone. We all crave that sense that what we're doing has some level of value and purpose.
On which note, dear listener, if you enjoy the Exam Study Expert podcast, do take a moment to leave us a short review if we've been able to help you in any way. Hopefully that's very clear why we love that so much. So please do that. And the same token, if there are any other kind of creative products, YouTube channels, podcasts, books you've read, taking that moment to leave that review just means so much to the author, the creator behind that, who in many cases has poured so much of themselves into producing that. Just taking that moment to share what you thought and how much you enjoyed it, how much it's helped, just means the world to us to us creators. So Charlie, this has been so interesting. Is there anything you think we haven't touched on that you think would be interesting to bring up before we start to bring this to a close?
I suppose it's the kind of practical side of things, that if you are in your early 20s or going through a career change, or if you're 17, 18, thinking about what to do at university, how you can make those decisions in a sensible way. I don't know if I've got much to say based on my interviews, but it's certainly a kind of crazy thing that when we make our career decisions, we really know very little about the world and about ourselves. And yet, as I was just talking about, most people don't really go through life with a career plan. And so often the decisions you make when you're that age end up that being the kind of path you walk down for the next 30, 40 years.
I think given the amount of time we spend in our working lives, it's scary how little thought we give to making that choice, making that decision. If you add up the number of hours of time that the average person spends in the soul searching, doing the researching, trying things out, it's very, very little time compared to the, 60, 70,000 hours of your adult life is spent at work. It's crazy. I don't know, Charlie, is there anything that would have helped? Because in hindsight, the path looks clear, like doing the law conversion course, kind of knowing how it would end up for you. But, with hindsight, it doesn't seem like the right choice. But is there any way that the version of you pre-doing that law conversion course could have learned that?
It's that's a good question. I'd done a huge amount of work experience in preparation for it, and but the kind of human mind is a very powerful thing. You can basically rationalize your way to any decision once you've kind of you've decided upon it. Perhaps what we're talking about more generally is just this kind of being extremely honest with yourself about where these ideas are coming from. Is it because you're pursuing some kind of high status? Is it because you want money? All of those are kind of fair and valid goals and aspirations, but often we clothe them in other things. We say, I want to do this career because it's a good job. It's going to give me good skills that I can then use to do the thing that I really want to do down the line. Well, the other lesson of this book is that people very rarely make that leap, doing 3 or 4 years in a job that, perhaps a corporate job, and then doing something apart from you, Will, I should add. Be sort of truly honest with, don't talk to yourself like it's a job interview where you need to dress everything up in the language that you think others would find acceptable. If you want to pursue a high status job because status is something that really matters to you, then fine, but be honest with yourself. In terms of things that I should have done, there's a book called Designing Your Life by, I think, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. So I've just looked that up. And there's a good piece of advice in there, which comes back to this idea of what constitutes a good task. And they recommend doing a good time diary. So whenever you're in your job or you're doing work experience, kind of write down a list, kind of table of how you're spending your time and then how it makes you feel. I did that, but only when I was sort of 6 months into pupillage. And I could see I was spending, 6 hours a day reading particular documents, 5 hours a day writing, and the scores that I was giving myself for those were quite low. Just as you should make a large list, you should also just go out there and try as much as possible. People like to talk about themselves and their own careers. So if you message people on LinkedIn and say, I'm really interested to hear how you got your current job, that's a great way of exposing yourself to lots of different jobs, getting work experience and things like that. And don't just stick to jobs that someone in your position would be expected to do. So last year I worked as a construction labourer whilst I was finishing off the book for 2 or 3 days a week. And I found that extremely, extremely rewarding. I loved the work. I thought it was, I learned so much doing it. And I wouldn't have done that when I was 20, 21 because you've got your tunnel vision on. So it's just about casting an extremely wide net, all the while being extremely honest with yourself. Buckle up and enjoy the ride.
Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us once again on the show. It's been a really interesting conversation today, and I hope it sparked some useful food for thought for those listening. So, Charlie, if anybody's interested in learning more about your work on working, where would be the best place for them to go?
So the book's called "Is This Working? The Jobs We Do, Told by the People Who Do Them," and it's in all good bookshops and also on all major e-commerce websites. But maybe go into a bookshop and support them if you can. And I've got a Substack called The Administration of Things, which I occasionally blog from, but no other social media. And perhaps that's another piece of advice. I've felt a lot happier since stripping away all of that stuff.
Well, thank you so much once again, Charlie. And an extra little bonus bit of advice for us there at the end, which I think is I'd fully endorse, stripping away some of the social media, and I think exposure to the news media cycle in the way that many of us are. Just dialing all that noise back a little bit in our lives can do wonders for our day-to-day well-being and our mental health. So I wanted to share just a few of my top takeaways from this conversation, because I think there are some points in here that are really worth highlighting and reiterating. So the first one is just to say that Charlie says that the state of uncertainty is when you're most vulnerable to the ideas of others. These influences can be positive, though not necessarily. So be especially wary and stand guard at the door of your mind when you're making choices in times of uncertainty, when you yourself feel a little bit uncertain, unsettled, and be sure that if you are being influenced by external voices and even, very well-meaning advice that, it is trying to have your best interest at heart, really take extra care that the choices you're making in those circumstances are in line with your values and where you want to take your life. Secondly, when you strip out the superficial elements of your job, or perhaps the job you're aspiring to, what's left? So if you don't get to parade around in a suit or in an academic gown or a lab coat or scrubs or whatever, and you're going to get that glow of status in the eyes of your community and society at large, if you don't have those after-work socials, if you don't have the little treats and perks that some jobs may offer, you don't have the big vacations that you may be able to afford with your paycheck. If you strip all that back, do you actually like the fundamental tasks that you do? Do they bring you some satisfaction on some level, maybe from the raw intellectual challenge and the thrill of problem solving, or from helping someone in some way? Or is all the fluff around it sort of just a salve and it kind of just numbs and distracts you from a fundamental set of tasks you don't particularly enjoy? Things that can lead to more enjoyment of those tasks include having that clear and immediate result. So you can look around at the end of cleaning a house or writing some code and see the change, or maybe you've helped someone, or maybe you get some positive feedback from somebody. You've done a good piece of work, and you're in a work culture where your clients or your supervisors or your line manager, will turn around and kind of pat you on the back and say, great job, well done. We want to try and avoid too much admin load in our work. That can, Charlie's research shows that for many people, even when they enjoy the core task, there's all this kind of bureaucracy, paperwork and meetings about meetings and all this sort of stuff that gets in the way of being able to just get on and do the task that is your job. And that can be quite frustrating for people when that admin load gets too high. Planning is helpful, but be open to your plan evolving. It was really interesting when Charlie said that at no point in all the people he interviewed did anyone say that, well, actually, the thing that led me to get into my current line of work was I was sitting down with a skills matrix that determined what I was good at, and that determined the path for the rest of my life. So it's kind of difficult advice here, but sort of being open to opportunities the world puts in front of you, being open to your interests evolving and emerging, and look out for doors that seem interesting to push open, even if those aren't the doors that you intended to push on 5, 10, 20 years ago. As your grandma or spiritual leader might have told you many times, beware chasing money or status. There's nothing wrong with chasing either, and we certainly need a level of income to be stable in life, but beware putting these idols above our own well-being. And finally, there's a really interesting one for me about crisis breeding satisfaction. So if you are currently going through difficult times, either in your study, either in the kind of world of studying and academia, or in a kind of professional context, if you have a job or you're in a career at the moment, I think it's really interesting what Charlie was saying about how so for many people, having been through that really, really difficult patch, they've kind of hit rock bottom and then recovered from it and pulled themselves back, and you kind of develop a level of life satisfaction that can be quite hard to get to otherwise if everything had been plain sailing the whole time. So a silver lining perhaps of finding things difficult, finding times hard, is that when we can get ourselves out of that, there is light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully. Once we can kind of recover from that and get out of that, you have a sense of life satisfaction and kind of appreciation and gratitude for what you have that's quite hard to gain otherwise. So thank you so much for tuning in today. It's been a real pleasure to have your company. And as I say, I hope there's been some useful food for thought off the back of this episode, whether things you're thinking about in terms of your own journey or your own life, or perhaps for those around you, you know, perhaps especially if you're a parent, a teacher, a mentor of some kind, some things that you might be able to use to support others who you care about. I look forward to seeing you again next Sunday for another episode. Next time is going to be a replay episode. We're going to be revisiting one of my absolute favourite episodes from last year and replaying that for you. So really looking forward to that. For now, I just wanted to wish you every success, as always, in your studies. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.